Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we're breaking down 3 of the most disturbing cases out there. Stay until the end, because the last story is going to leave you completely shocked. Each one vanished on an ordinary day, doing something completely ordinary. Walking to a bus stop, riding a bike to a video store, playing video games in a department store while his mother shopped 20 feet away. In every single one of these cases, police found a suspect fast. Sometimes within days, sometimes within weeks, and in every single case that suspect walked free, for years, sometimes for decades, while investigators chased alibis that fell apart, tips that led nowhere, and theories that collapsed the moment real evidence showed up. In one of these cases, the man police questioned and released within weeks of the crime was, in fact, the actual killer, and he would go on to live an ordinary life for 26 more years before anyone came back for him. In another, the wrong man became so infamous, so widely assumed to be guilty, that the boy's own father spent almost 3 decades convinced he had his answer, only for the official closure of the case to still leave real questions unresolved, even years later. In every one of these 3 stories, the real answer waited far longer than anyone could have imagined, hiding in plain sight the entire time. In a bodega 2 blocks from a bus stop, in a small town less than an hour from a family's front door, and in the confession of a man who had already been questioned and dismissed once before. In one of these cases, the real killer confessed to his own family years before police ever learned his name. In another, the man investigators eventually named as the killer had already been questioned and released within days of the crime, sitting in an interview room the whole time, completely unaware of how close he actually was to getting caught. In the third, the case was closed on a confession that was never fully proven, and questions about it are still being debated by journalists and investigators today. These are 3 of the most famous unsolved child murders in American history. Each one helped build the child safety systems that exist across the country today. Each one took years, in one case closer to 3 decades, before anyone could say with any confidence who was actually responsible. This is the story of Etan Patz, Jacob Wetterling, and Adam Walsh. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover real cold cases every week. Cases where the truth waited years, sometimes decades, to come out. Cases where the official record, the court transcripts, and the confessions all eventually lined up to tell us exactly what happened, no matter how long it took to get there. And if you're already subscribed, tap that like button. It helps these stories reach more people who never knew the full details behind them. Let's start in New York City, 1979. The first story: Etan Patz, the boy who never made it to the bus stop. On the morning of May 25, 1979, 6-year-old Etan Patz asked his mother, Julie, if he could walk to his school bus stop alone for the very first time. It was only 2 blocks from their apartment in the Soho neighborhood of Manhattan. Julie had walked in there herself nearly every day before that morning, but feeling her son was growing up, she agreed to let him go on his own. Etan left the apartment carrying a canvas bag decorated with small elephants and $1 he planned to spend on a soda along the way. He never arrived at the bus stop. He was never seen again. Both of his parents worked as photographers, which meant investigators had access to an unusually large collection of clear, recent photographs of Etan to distribute, images that would go on to become some of the most widely recognized in the entire missing children movement. Etan lived in Soho, a neighborhood that in 1979 looked nothing like the fashionable district it would later become, full of old cast-iron warehouses, working artists renting cheap loft space, and small, family-run shops lining the sidewalks. It was, in many ways, an unusual place to raise a young family, but also a close-knit one, where shopkeepers knew the local children by name and parents kept a loose, informal watch over one another's kids. Eitan was bright, independent, and adventurous for his age, the kind of child neighbors noticed. That morning was supposed to be a small milestone, the first time he'd make the 2-block walk on his own. A woman waiting nearby for her own child expected to see Eitan arrive at the stop around 8:20 that morning, the way he usually did. He never came. What followed was one of the largest searches New York City had ever mounted for a single missing child. Police canvassed the neighborhood block by block. Search dogs combed nearby buildings, rooftops, and basements. Officers questioned shopkeepers and delivery drivers about anything unusual. The search for information about Eitan eventually stretched as far as Israel, as tips and reported sightings poured in from across the world. Nothing turned up. No body. No confirmed sighting after he left his building. Eitan's disappearance would go on to change the country. Before 1979, there was no coordinated national system for tracking missing children at all. His photo became one of the first printed on milk cartons distributed to grocery stores nationwide. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25th National Missing Children's Day, directly because of his case. His disappearance also helped push forward the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But for Julie and Stanley Pates, none of that told them what had actually happened to their son. Within a year, detectives had zeroed in on a man named Jose Ramos. Ramos was dating a woman who had occasionally walked Eitan home from school. He also had a documented history as a convicted child molester. Under questioning, Ramos made a chilling, half-formed admission. He said he had taken a young boy back to his apartment and abused him around that same time, and that he was 90% sure that boy had been Eitan. But he claimed he had let the boy go afterward, alive and unharmed. If that detail was true, it created a serious contradiction, because Eitan never came home. If the boy Ramos described really was Eitan, and Ramos really had released him alive, then something else, and someone else entirely, must have happened to Eitan after that. Detectives pressed the case against Ramos for years. They learned he had separately been investigated for trying to lure 2 boys into a drain pipe in the Bronx, where he had reportedly been living at the time. He was known to spend time in Washington Square Park, where Eitan sometimes played. In 2003, under sworn questioning as part of a civil case, Ramos denied ever encountering Eitan at all, telling attorneys he had nothing to hide. But none of the suspicion ever moved beyond coincidence. There was no body, no independent witness, no physical evidence prosecutors could take to a grand jury. Ramos was eventually sent to prison anyway, for an unrelated child sexual assault case in Pennsylvania, and spent roughly 20 years behind bars, all while remaining, in the public's mind, the presumed killer of Eitan Pates. For most of America, if they knew one name connected to this case at all, it was his. Through the 1980s and 90s, the case went cold. In 1991, Ramos reportedly bragged to a fellow inmate about details of Eitan's disappearance that had never been made public. For a moment, it looked like a break. Once again, prosecutors decided it wasn't enough. Eitan was legally declared dead in 2001, 22 years after he vanished. In 2004, the Pats family won a $2 million civil judgment against Ramos. He never paid it. Criminally, the case remained wide open, and Jose Ramos remained the only name anyone had ever seriously connected to it. In 2010, a new Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr., reopened the case. 2 years later, in April of 2012, investigators excavated the basement of a building on Prince Street, just around the corner from Eitan's old apartment. After 4 days of digging, they found nothing conclusive. But the media coverage of that dig, splashed across newspapers and television broadcasts throughout New York City for days, reached a man in New Jersey named Jose Lopez, who called police with a story he'd been carrying for years. His brother-in-law, a man named Pedro Hernandez, had once told him he had killed a child decades earlier in New York. Hernandez had been an 18-year-old stock boy working at a bodega near Eitan's bus stop back in 1979. Investigators had never once considered him a suspect. As detectives dug deeper, they found Hernandez had told versions of this story for years, to his wife, to his church prayer group, to a childhood friend from back home. None of them had ever reported it. Most had simply assumed he was exaggerating or dealing with some kind of private mental struggle, and none of them had ever connected his words to the famous unsolved disappearance of Eitan Pates. In May of 2012, police brought 51-year-old Pedro Hernandez in for formal questioning at a prosecutor's office near his home in Camden, New Jersey. At first, he denied any involvement. After more than 6 hours of continuous questioning, according to the detective who led the interview, his story finally broke. "I'm sorry," he reportedly said. "It shouldn't have happened. I did it." Once formally read his rights, he repeated the confession on camera, describing how he lured 6-year-old Eitan into the bodega's basement, choked him, placed his body inside a bag, and left it out with the store's regular trash. One detail in particular stood out to investigators. When Hernandez led them to the basement, he pointed out a doorway he did not remember existing back in 1979. Investigators researched the building's construction history and found the door actually had been added after 1979, a detail prosecutors would later argue only the real killer could have known. Records also later showed Hernandez had repeated versions of his confession to 2 separate psychiatrists while awaiting trial, and told one of them he had first confessed at a prayer meeting all the way back in 1979, within days of the murder itself. Through the decades of dead ends, Julian Stanley Pates stayed in the public eye, refusing to let their son's case fade the way so many others quietly do. They gave interviews for years, kept his photograph circulating, and pushed continuously for the case to remain a priority for whichever Manhattan district attorney happened to hold office. It was that persistence, kept alive across 3 different decades, that helped ensure the case was still being actively worked when the break finally came. Hernandez was charged with murder and kidnapping. His defense attorney, Harvey Fishbein, argued that Hernandez suffered from schizotypal personality disorder, along with an intelligence quotient of roughly 70, and struggled in a very real, documented way to separate fantasy from reality. Fishbein told the jury his client had likely become fixated over the years on a false, imagined memory of hurting a child, repeating it so many times to so many people that he had eventually come to believe it himself, whether or not it had ever actually happened. There was no body, no DNA, no forensic trace of any kind. Nothing beyond Hernandez's own words, spoken first informally to the people closest to him, and later formally to police. His first trial, in 2015, stretched on for roughly 4 months and ended in a hung jury after 18 days of deliberation. 11 jurors for guilty, 1 against. The judge declared a mistrial. Manhattan prosecutors chose to retry the case rather than let it go. The second trial unfolded much the same way. built around Hernandez's repeated confessions and that one detail about the basement doorway that only the real killer could have known. This time, after 9 days of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. On February 14, 2017, Pedro Hernandez was found guilty of kidnapping and murder, nearly 38 years after Eitan disappeared. At sentencing, Eitan's father, Stanley Pates, addressed Hernandez directly, telling him he had thrown away a precious child like garbage and that he would never be forgiven for it. Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Jose Ramos, the man suspected for decades before Hernandez ever entered the picture, was never criminally charged in connection with Eitan's case. He finished his Pennsylvania sentence in 2012, the same year Hernandez confessed, and was almost immediately rearrested for violating sex offender registration rules. He always denied any involvement in Eitan's disappearance. Even after a conviction, the case wasn't finished. In 2025, a federal appeals court ruled a mistake had been made during jury deliberations at the second trial and overturned the conviction, ordering a third trial. Jose Ramos died on March 7, 2026, at 82 years old, before that third trial could ever begin, taking with him the last living link to the theory that had dominated the case for over 3 decades. Then, on June 22, 2026, the United States Supreme Court reinstated Hernandez's conviction in a 6-3 decision, ruling that the lower appeals court had overstepped its authority. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg called Eitan's killing a horrific murder that had changed a generation of New Yorkers. Eitan's body was never found. He has no grave to visit. But after 47 years, the legal fight over what happened to him has, at last, reached what appears to be its true end. A conviction tested by 2 separate juries, an appeals court, and finally, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court itself, and one that has now survived every single one of those challenges. Looking back at the Eitan Pates case, the delay comes down to one uncomfortable truth. The wrong man fit the profile too well. Jose Ramos was a convicted child predator with a real connection to Eitan's family, and once investigators locked onto him, that focus shaped the entire case for over 30 years. Meanwhile, Pedro Hernandez, an ordinary bodega worker with no criminal record and no known connection to the Pates family beyond geography, never appeared on anyone's radar, despite repeating his confession to multiple people over multiple decades. It took a completely unrelated media event, a basement excavation that found nothing at all, to accidentally shake loose the tip that finally connected the dots. That was Eitan Pates, a boy whose case ran for 47 years, through 2 trials, a mistrial, an overturned conviction, and finally the Supreme Court of the United States, before it was truly settled. Our next case takes us to rural Minnesota 10 years later. This one moves differently. There's no courtroom drama stretching across decades, no back and forth between competing suspects splashed across the news for years on end. Instead, it's a story about something almost more unsettling. The actual killer was sitting in an interview room with police just weeks after the crime, and he simply walked right back out the door into an ordinary life for the next 26 years. The second story. Jacob Wetterling, the masked man on the road. On the evening of October 22, 1989, 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling was riding his bike home from a video store in St. Joseph, Minnesota, along with his younger brother, Trevor, and his friend, Aaron Larson. It was a dark, cold autumn night in rural Stearns County, the kind of small town where kids still rode their bikes after dark without a second thought. As the three boys pedaled up a gravel driveway near Jacob's home, a masked man carrying a revolver suddenly stepped out and stopped them. He asked the boys their ages. Then he ordered Trevor and Aaron to run into a nearby wooded ditch and not look back, warning that he would shoot them if they did. Terrified, the two boys obeyed, running as fast as they could into the dark. When Aaron finally worked up the courage to look back, both Jacob and the man were gone. There had been no time to see a face, no time to get a license plate. Just a man, a gun, and then nothing at all. Jacob was never seen alive again. The disappearance triggered a massive search and made national news within days. Search parties combed fields, ditches, and wooded areas across Stearns County for weeks on end, working around the clock in the cold Minnesota autumn. A reward fund grew large as donations poured in from across the country, and police received thousands of tips, most of which led absolutely nowhere, each one still requiring hours of investigators' time to rule out. Jacob's parents, Patty and Jerry Wetterling, became the public face of the search, appearing on television again and again, refusing to let their son's case fade from view. There was another detail investigators would only later connect. 9 months earlier, in January of 1989, a 12-year-old boy named Jared Shirel had been abducted while walking home from a cafe in nearby Cold Spring, Minnesota. A man pulled up in a car, asked him for directions, then forced him inside and sexually assaulted him, before telling him to run and not look back, or he'd shoot. The similarities to Jacob's abduction, the same threat, the same method, towns just 10 miles apart, were obvious to investigators from the start. But for years, they couldn't prove the same man committed both crimes. In December of 1989, just weeks after Jacob's abduction, the FBI actually questioned a local man named Danny Heinrich. A Stearns County deputy had flagged him as a possible suspect within days of Jacob's disappearance. He matched physical descriptions given by witnesses. He lived in Painesville, an area where a string of at least 8 unsolved attacks on young boys had occurred throughout the 1980s, most within a mile of his own home. One victim, a boy named Chris Bertelson, was attacked twice by a heavy-set man in that same neighborhood as a young teenager. "We lived in terror," Bertelson said years later. "It seemed to me he was picking out our friend group. He was stalking us." Investigators took a DNA sample and a hair sample from Heinrich in 1990, and then they released him. There wasn't enough evidence to hold him. Heinrich went back to his ordinary life, working, eventually, at a plywood company, describing himself later as someone who had never struggled with addiction. Investigators, meanwhile, kept chasing other leads for years, other men, other theories, other dead ends, while the one man they'd already had in a room walked free less than an hour from Jacob's home. He would remain free for 26 more years. The case went cold for over 2 decades. Jacob's mother, Patty Wetterling, transformed her grief into a mission, co-founding an organization dedicated to child safety and becoming one of the most prominent advocates for missing children in the entire country, all while never knowing what had actually happened to her own son. Meanwhile, an ordinary woman named Joy Baker, who had been 22 years old when Jacob vanished and had never stopped thinking about the case, started writing her own blog about it in 2010, working as an amateur investigator in her spare time. She became particularly focused on the Jared Shirel assault, convinced the same man was responsible for both crimes. Her work, and a 2014 appearance alongside Shirel on CNN's The Hunt, helped renew public and investigative pressure to take another serious look at the case. In November of 2014, authorities formally reopened the case and re-examined the physical evidence tied to Shirel's assault. One investigator later admitted that once they took a fresh look at Heinrich's file, it was not at all clear why he had ever stopped being treated as a serious suspect in the first place. Testimony would later reveal that at least 8 separate unsolved sexual assaults on young boys in Painesville during the 1980s had taken place within less than a mile of Heinrich's own home, and that Heinrich matched physical descriptions given not only by Sherrill, but by the boys who had been with Jacob the night he vanished. On July 10, 2015, a letter arrived at the Stearns County Sheriff's Office confirming what investigators had suspected for years. DNA recovered from the sleeve of Sherrill's sweatshirt in 1989 matched a hair sample Danny Heinrich had voluntarily given police back in 1990. We realize that now we have the one thing on Danny Heinrich that we've never had in 25 years, Stearns County Sheriff John Sanner said at the time. We have positive physical evidence linking him to a crime he has steadfastly denied. Even faced with a DNA match, Heinrich continued denying any involvement in either case. While investigators chased leads across the state, Patty Wetterling turned her grief into advocacy, co-founding a resource center dedicated to missing and exploited children and becoming one of the most recognized child safety advocates in the country. She testified before Congress. She helped shape state and federal policy. And for 27 straight years, she did all of it without knowing whether her son was alive, whether he had suffered, or where his body might be. Investigators, meanwhile, quietly kept working the case in the background for decades, revisiting old files, retesting evidence as forensic technology improved, and periodically re-interviewing witnesses whose memories had inevitably begun to fade. Every few years, a new tip would surface, a new name would be floated, and each time, the family would brace themselves for an answer that never quite arrived. There was a problem. The statute of limitations on Sherrill's assault had already expired years earlier. Heinrich couldn't be charged for that crime no matter what the DNA showed, and there still wasn't enough direct evidence to charge him with Jacob's murder either. But investigators obtained a search warrant for his home in July of 2015. When they searched it, they found child pornography, and in October of that year arrested him, facing 25 separate federal charges in total, enough to potentially keep him in prison for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened with the Wetterling case. Facing decades in prison on those charges alone, Heinrich agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to a single child pornography charge, he agreed to fully confess to what he did to both Jared Sherrill and Jacob Wetterling, and to lead investigators to Jacob's remains. He would not be criminally prosecuted for Jacob's murder itself. On September 1, 2016, Heinrich led authorities to a rural pasture near Painesville, Minnesota, roughly 30 miles from Jacob's home, where he had buried the boy nearly 27 years earlier. Dental records confirmed the remains were Jacob's. Among what investigators recovered was the jersey Jacob had been wearing the night he was taken. 5 days later, on September 6, 2016, Danny Heinrich stood in federal court and described in chilling detail exactly what he had done. He testified that he had a mask and a revolver that night, and that he could no longer recall exactly what the 3 boys said to him in those first frightening seconds. He said he handcuffed Jacob behind his back and forced him into his car, then drove him to a rural area near Painesville, where he sexually assaulted him. He said he kept a police scanner running in the car the entire time. He said Jacob told him he was cold. He said Jacob cried and asked to go home. According to Heinrich's own account, at one point, still handcuffed, Jacob looked at him and asked, "What did I do wrong?" Heinrich told the court his revolver had not even been loaded when he took Jacob, not until he panicked later that same day and loaded it. Then he shot him. Judge John Tunheim asked Heinrich directly whether he had abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered Jacob Wetterling. Yes, I did, Heinrich answered. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison on the child pornography charge, with the possibility of civil commitment afterward that could keep him confined for the rest of his life. Because of the plea agreement, and because the statute of limitations on his assault of Jared Shirel had already run out decades earlier, Heinrich was never criminally charged with either Jacob's murder or the assault on Shirel. In 2021, partly in response to cases like this one, Minnesota changed its laws to eliminate the statute of limitations on sexual violence entirely, so that a delay like this could never again put a confessed predator permanently out of reach of prosecution. Jared Shirel, the survivor whose case ultimately cracked the mystery wide open, later said publicly that he had spent decades wondering why his own attack seemed to matter so little, only to learn it held the exact evidence that would eventually solve Jacob's murder. He was 39 years old by the time he finally got to see the man who had abducted him held accountable, even if only for an unrelated charge. Patty Wetterling, after 27 years of uncertainty, was finally able to bury her son and give him the funeral she had waited nearly 3 decades to hold. Jacob's case directly inspired the 1994 federal Jacob Wetterling Act, which required states to establish sex offender registries, a law that, in some form, now exists across the entire country. The Wetterling case represents perhaps the most unsettling pattern of all 3 stories, because the actual killer was never lost to investigators at all. He was questioned within weeks of the crime. He gave a DNA and hair sample voluntarily. He lived less than an hour from the Wetterling family for the entire 27 years the case remained open. What was missing wasn't a suspect. It was the forensic technology and legal patience to connect him definitively to the crime, and the persistence of one dedicated blogger and one surviving victim willing to keep pushing the case back into the spotlight, decades after most of the country had assumed it would never be solved. That was Jacob Wetterling, a case cracked open, in the end, by patient, old-fashioned DNA work applied to an entirely different crime, decades after the fact, thanks in large part to one ordinary woman who simply refused to stop asking questions. Our final case takes us further south, to Florida, 8 years before Jacob was even born. It's the case that, more than any other on this list, changed how America as a whole thinks about missing children. And it ends not with a courtroom verdict, but with a press conference and a conclusion that not everyone is fully convinced was ever really proven at all. The third story. Adam Walsh gone in 20 feet. On the afternoon of July 27, 1981, Reve Walsh brought her 6-year-old son Adam to a Sears department store inside a mall in Hollywood, Florida, directly across the street from the local police department itself. She left him in the toy department, watching a group of older kids play a video game console, while she walked to another aisle roughly 20 feet away to look at lamps. She was gone only a few minutes, just long enough to look at a display of lamps in another part of the store. When she came back, Adam was nowhere to be found. She searched the toy aisle, then the surrounding departments, then began asking store employees if they had seen him, her panic rising with every passing minute as it became clear her son was truly gone. Investigators later learned that a store security guard had ordered a group of children, including Adam, to leave that section of the store shortly before he vanished, meaning Adam had likely been pushed outside, alone, into a crowded mall parking lot, at the exact moment a predator would have had the perfect opportunity to grab him unnoticed. A frantic citywide search began immediately, involving local police, volunteers, and eventually agencies from across the state. Florida would go on to become the first state in the country to establish a formal clearinghouse for missing children cases, directly as a result of what happened to Adam. For 2 agonizing weeks, his parents had no answers at all. Then, on August 10th, 1981, 2 fishermen found a severed head in a drainage canal alongside a rural Florida highway, more than 100 miles from the mall where Adam had disappeared. It was Adam's. The rest of his body was never recovered. The investigation that followed was plagued by errors from nearly the very first day. It took a full week before the FBI became involved, precious time that could never be recovered. Detectives eventually obtained a Cadillac belonging to a man named Otis Toole and found bloodstains on the front and rear floorboards. But the blood-stained carpeting, and eventually the car itself, was lost by the department before either could ever be properly tested. Evidence that might have settled the entire case decades earlier simply disappeared from police custody, never to be recovered. Years later, reflecting on how badly the case had been mishandled, John Walsh put it simply: so many mistakes were made. It was, in his words, shocking, inexcusable, and heartbreaking. Toole was already known to investigators. He was a drifter and small-time criminal who had partnered for years with one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, Henry Lee Lucas. The 2 men had confessed, jointly and separately, to an almost unbelievable number of murders across the country, most of which turned out, on investigation, to be false. In the weeks after Adam vanished, Hollywood, Florida was gripped by fear. Parents stopped letting children walk anywhere alone. Store security tightened across the entire region. Investigators chased down dozens of reported sightings and tips in those first weeks, nearly all of which led nowhere, while John and Reve Walsh waited, with no way of knowing that their son had likely already been killed within hours of his disappearance. The discovery of Adam's severed head 2 weeks later, and more than 100 miles away, told investigators the killer had traveled a significant distance, which meant the search area they should have been focused on from the very beginning was far larger than anyone had initially assumed. In October of 1983, while jailed on unrelated arson charges, Toole told an investigator he had kidnapped a boy from a Florida mall and killed him. When Hollywood police visited him on October 19th, he confessed directly to killing Adam. He took detectives to the bus bench outside the Sears, where he said he'd snatched the boy, then to a stretch of turnpike where he claimed Adam had cried for his mother, and finally to a bridge where he said he had cut off the boy's head. He described luring Adam into his Cadillac with candy, choking him, and using a machete because he feared the boy could identify him later. Investigators later tracked down a machete Toole had access to at the business where he'd purchased that same Cadillac. His description of the beheading matched details from the autopsy that had never been made public. But other parts of his story fell apart almost immediately. He got Adam's hair color wrong. He misdescribed his clothing. He initially claimed his partner, Henry Lee Lucas, had been with him, but records showed Lucas had been in jail at the time of the murder, hundreds of miles away. Investigators also recovered a pair of green shorts and a sandal from Toole's home in Jacksonville, similar to clothing Adam had reportedly been wearing the day he disappeared, a detail John Walsh would point to for years afterward as one of the pieces of evidence he found most convincing. 3 months later, Toole recanted the entire confession. Then, months after that, he confessed again. This pattern, confess, recant, would repeat for years, all the way up until his death. Detectives were never able to build a case solid enough to formally charge him. Some names besides Toole were floated over the years too, including, briefly and without any real evidence, the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, a theory that went nowhere and was never taken seriously by investigators. But that shows just how desperate the public had become for any kind of answer. Toole was already a deeply disturbing figure by then. A drifter with a troubled history, he had partnered for years with fellow serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, and the two men, together and separately, confessed to an almost unbelievable number of murders across the country, most of which investigators eventually determined were false, told simply for attention or manipulation. Toole later admitted to committing his first killing at just 14 years old. In 1982, he was convicted and sentenced to death for a separate murder in Jacksonville, Florida, a sentence that was later reduced to life in prison on appeal. Otis Toole died in a Florida prison of liver failure on September 15, 1996, at 49 years old, while serving multiple life sentences for other murders. No relative ever claimed his body. He was buried at the prison. The Adam Walsh case remained formally unsolved for another 12 years after that. John Walsh had, by then, spent years publicly criticizing the Hollywood Police Department's handling of the case, writing in his 1997 book, Tears of Rage, that the investigation had been shockingly, inexcusably mishandled from the very beginning. Then, in the mid-2000s, a niece of Toole's came forward and told John Walsh that her uncle had made one final confession to killing Adam on his deathbed, shortly before he died. A confession made, notably, at a moment when Toole had absolutely nothing left to gain from lying. On December 16, 2008, Hollywood Police Chief Chadwick Wagner held a press conference and formally closed the case, naming Otis Toole as Adam's killer. There was no new physical evidence, no DNA, no definitive proof. The closure rested entirely on a full review of the case file and the accumulated weight of everything investigators had gathered over 27 years. Wagner himself was blunt about the limits of what they actually had. There was no magic wand, he said, no single piece of evidence that sealed it. But the department had concluded that the full weight of everything pointed to Toole and to no one else. Our agency has devoted an inordinate amount of time seeking leads to other potential perpetrators, rather than emphasizing Otis Toole as our primary suspect, Wagner told reporters. Otis Toole has continued to be our only real suspect. John Walsh, Adam's father, had waited 27 years for that moment. For 27 years, we've been asking who could take a 6-year-old boy and murder him and decapitate him, he told reporters that day. Who? We needed to know. We needed to know. And today, we know. His wife, Reve, placed a small photo of Adam on the podium as he spoke. Not everyone was fully convinced. Journalists and researchers who had covered the case for decades pointed out that the closure announcement introduced no new physical evidence at all. No DNA, no forensic proof, nothing beyond a rereading of the same file investigators had already had for over 2 decades. Significant, unresolved contradictions in Toole's various confessions, including his repeatedly wrong description of Adam's clothing and hair color, and his initial, false claim that Henry Lee Lucas had been present for the murder, were never fully explained. Even the new police chief who announced the closure, Chadwick Wagner, acknowledged the department had made numerous missteps over the years and publicly apologized to the Walsh family for how the investigation had originally been handled. To this day, some who have studied the case closely consider Toole's guilt an educated conclusion reached from the weight of circumstantial evidence, rather than an absolutely, forensically proven fact. What is not in dispute is the impact Adam's case had on the entire country. His parents helped push Congress to pass the 1982 Missing Children Act, which required the FBI to add missing children's information to a national database for the very first time. Decades later, in 2006, President George W. Bush signed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act into law, creating a national sex offender registry and tracking system that carries Adam's name to this day. John Walsh went on to host America's Most Wanted for 25 years, a show credited with helping capture hundreds of wanted fugitives. The family also helped found what is now the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the same organization that would later assist in the search for both Jacob Wetterling and Etan Pates, connecting all three of these cases together in ways their families could never have imagined at the time. Of the three cases in this compilation, Adam Walsh's is the only one that never produced a courtroom verdict, a DNA match, or a definitive piece of physical evidence connecting a name to the crime. It was closed by a police department's judgment call, built on the accumulated weight of a deeply troubled man's repeated, contradictory confessions, and a family's 27-year need for an answer. That is what makes it different from the other two stories tonight, and why, even years later, it remains the one case on this list that some researchers argue was never truly, conclusively solved at all. Three cases that permanently changed how an entire country protects its children. Look closely at how each case actually broke open, and a pattern emerges that should unsettle anyone who assumes police work moves in a straight line toward the truth. None of these three breakthroughs came from a single, brilliant piece of detective work happening in the moment. Each one came years, sometimes decades, after the fact, and each one depended almost entirely on evidence, or people, that had been sitting quietly in place the entire time, waiting to be looked at again with fresh eyes. In each case, the man who was eventually identified as the real killer had, at some point, already sat directly across a table from investigators, sometimes literally in an interrogation room, years or even decades before anyone fully understood what he had actually done. Jose Ramos was questioned repeatedly, investigated for years, and never criminally charged, even though he remained the presumed killer in the public imagination for over 3 decades. Danny Heinrich was questioned by the FBI within weeks of Jacob's abduction, gave a DNA sample, and was released, free to live an ordinary life for 26 more years before an old sweatshirt sleeve finally caught up to him. Otis Toole confessed, recanted, confessed again, and recanted again for over a decade, sowing enough doubt each time that investigators could never quite close the case while he was still alive to keep changing his story. Etan Pates has no grave. His parents never received a body to bury, only a conviction, upheld, finally, by the highest court in the country. Adam Walsh's body was only ever partially recovered. His parents buried what little could be returned to them, and spent the rest of their lives turning unbearable grief into a system meant to protect other people's children. Jacob Wetterling's family waited 27 years, almost 3 full decades, just to learn where their son's body had been buried in a quiet Minnesota pasture, and to finally bring him home. None of these 3 families ever got their sons back. What they got, eventually, each in their own time and after their own decades of waiting, was a name. And in 2 of these 3 cases, they got something else, almost rarer still. A killer who, in his own words, finally admitted exactly what he had done, and why. The families of Etan Pates, Jacob Wetterling, and Adam Walsh never met each other's sons. But because of what happened to each of these 3 boys in 3 different decades in 3 different corners of the country, an entire generation of American children grew up a little bit safer than the one before it. There is one more thread that connects all 3 of these cases, beyond the laws and the databases and the registries. In every single one, the break that finally moved the case forward didn't come from a brilliant piece of detective work happening in real time. It came from persistence, from a district attorney who made a personal promise and kept it years later. From a sheriff who refused to call his open cases cold, insisting they were simply old. From an amateur blogger who couldn't stop thinking about a boy she'd seen on the news when she was 22 years old. From a father who spent 27 years publicly, relentlessly, refusing to let anyone forget his son's name. None of these cases were solved quickly. None of them were solved cleanly. 2 of them ended in courtrooms, with juries, verdicts, and appeals stretching on for years afterward. The third ended in a press conference, built on a confession that some still argue was never fully, forensically proven. But in the end, all 3 of them were solved, in whatever form of resolution their families were ultimately able to receive, because somebody, somewhere, refused to stop looking, year after year, long after most people would have given up. If you made it to the end of this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't lose us. See you soon.